So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I want to welcome you guys to the panel for creating compelling characters. I'm super geeked to have brought some of these artists up here to help talk about what they do. And let's see, people are still filing in, so if a lot of them start coming down the aisle, they've asked that you kind of squeeze in a little bit to make room for everybody else. So my name is Justin Thavirat. I help out as a art department supervisor over at Blizzard, and we were really excited to do this panel, right, because creating compelling characters is a really important part of a lot of game development. And there's so many different ways to do it, depending on the type of game and the style. There's no one perfect, optimal way to design characters. So what we were able to do is get a lot of talented people up here to talk about their different techniques and styles, approaches, and philosophies, and help share that with you here today. So with that, what else? So also with the evaluation forms, please make sure to fill those out at the end of the session with that email that you get. I help out on the GDC advisory board, right? So for the visual arts track, and we're always looking at ways to improve the content for the VA track at GDC. So if you like this kind of material, if you enjoyed this, please let us know. If there are ways that you feel we can improve it or how to plus it for next time, let us know as well. We want to help make the content for the VA track applicable, awesome, fun, and inspiring stuff. So, what else? I think that's it. All right, we're going to get started here. And first up, we have Richard from Naughty Dog.
Hi. So is that working? Can you hear me? All right, my name's Richard Lyons. I'm a character concept artist at Naughty Dog. Been there for the last 3 years, working through Uncharted 4, and now working on The Lost Legacy and The Last of Us Part 2. I wanted to talk to you guys today about the notes coming up. Where are the notes that come up? Yeah. Right. Oh, we can just cut to this shot.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk to you guys today about showing your characters in context and how that can avoid some pitfalls of stereotypes and relying on cliches and sort of tropes that go into character design. So before we concentrate on this, I wanted to tell a little story. The other day I was tasked with concepting a tough guy, a strong, intimidating, physical character. So I went about it the normal way. Probably most of us here have been taught. How many here are concept artists at the moment? Oh, sweet. And character artists? Yeah, awesome. So essentially, for the most part, we're taught to present our characters in a lineup. It's a flat background, showing different costume designs as we go. So I did my tough guy, as we all do, big barrel chest, square jaw, big pose, clenched fists, and presented my costumes. One of the costumes had him wearing glasses, and I was showing it to a group of people, creative directors, designers, and a bunch of other people. Their reaction to the glasses was interesting to me. When they saw that, they said, no, he can't be wearing glasses. That's not indicative of a tough guy. And instantly alarm bells are ringing for me that I'm not showing these people enough. They're not seeing enough of the puzzle for them to make a decision about what this character is going to be and what they're going to wear and how we're going to present them. They're basically trying to tell the whole story at a glance, based on shape, language, and everything else, which is great for a lot of games. Team Fortress 2, at a glance, the big heavy guy moves slow, hits hard. But when you're working on games like Uncharted 4, The Last of Us, where the intentions of the character are totally ambiguous, or we don't even want that character to be reading that way at this point, but we want them to read another way at another point, all of these kind of cliches and stereotypes sort of fall apart. So today I'm going to show a new process that I've been using. It's still a work in progress, but I'm getting some good results, including that character now wears glasses. The first thing is our games are realistic character, narrative-driven games. So the first thing I do is I sit down and I plot out my narrative. So at the moment we're going to use the storyline of Stephen King's Carrie. Spoilers, if you haven't seen Carrie, I'm about to spoil a story for you. It's about a telekinetic, magic-powered girl, high school girl. She goes to school, she's ostracized, she's bullied, and eventually she's pushed too far and she murders all her peers with her telekinetic powers. So this is what I do, is I basically plot out my plot line, and you can see these little storyboards over here. The first one, she starts at a new school, she's optimistic, she's happy, she's picked on a little bit, she starts to be intimidated and starts to be scared. She's ostracized by her peers, so she's alone. She's then physically assaulted, and in Carrie there's the famous blood pouring on the head. I just had her in this one getting beat up. And then she unleashes her revenge and is empowered and murders everyone with their telekinetic powers. So this is the first thing I do, and I gather reference and create a little lineup based on that. So we're looking at a whole bunch of reference here, and already we can see pitfalls that we probably want to avoid. There's some really great characters in Ralph Macchio for The Outsiders and some other complex characters. There's Carrie over there in the top left. And then you've got some pretty corny ones that aren't funny until you've had 20 beers, like Revenge of the Nerds and some other ones like that, Breakfast Club. At this point, you can already see that there's going to be things that people are going to respond to instantly. And if you wanted to take the cheap way out, sure, you could dress them like Revenge of the Nerds. Everyone knows that person's going to be ostracized according to some shape language invented in the 80s. So I create a little lineup at this point, going from one side to the other, trying to keep it fairly natural, but there's a few characters in there that you feel in the right circumstances might be ostracized. I've chosen this character because she's cute, she's small, she's not physically empowered, and hopefully because she is cute, you're going to feel some kind of protective instinct to her. So the next thing I do is I choose one of my plot points, because this is going to be our costume. These are thematical beats throughout the game. For us, it's very cinematic, so I'm always picturing it like a film. What is this person going to be wearing in each scene starts to matter. Oh, there's one missing here. So I'm chosen a character at this point. So let's look at these ones, and we choose a few of these scenes, and we start slotting in our characters. And we can see already that less and less has to be, there's less and less pressure on what the character is wearing in isolation, because we can already see from this scene that she's pressured by the way she's framed. The bully is filling the majority of the frame. She's squeezed over to one side. We see expression, we see lighting. So the creative director and art directors, when they look at these shots, are able to understand a little bit more about the character, and they don't have to rely on so many tropes. So as we go through the shot, you realize, hey, maybe some of these character types are a little bit heavy-handed. So for me, I chose this one here. I felt she was natural. She still looks scared. Our framing technique has made sure she looks pressured. Our camera is with her at chest height, so as an audience, we understand that we're with her in this experience. And at this point, you can already see that someone has to make a decision about a costume. Looking at these has a little bit more information. So all of a sudden, these are less impactful. This is just more like, hey, this is the blueprint. This might even be the first step at a character sheet. These are what the creative directors are going to look at. So we can even just like swap the character out altogether. It doesn't have to be a small, cute girl anymore. It can just be this dude, this Ralph Macchio looking dude. And still, he looks pressured. He looks bullied. All of a sudden, stereotypes are completely gone. So from there, if we go back and we look at our whole lineup, I go through each scene and I start blocking shots off. So if we look at these, she starts a new day at school. It's a pretty standard framing. She looks nice, she's having a good time, the camera's a little bit low, she's slightly empowered. Perfect. Next shot, she's getting bullied. Just went through that one. Next shot, she's ostracized. These are super simple things. There's no background in this one. For a lot of them, I'm just grabbing a photo and blurring it in the background. But for this one, it tells a lot. There's a composition there where she feels ostracized. And we've got other things coming through, different costume designs as well. She's got her hands in her pockets in this one. And for the technical riggers and things out there, the scarf and the hair and the hands in the pockets is going to be an immediate red flag. Or late night, We have this one where she's finally physically assaulted and she's terrified, framing again. And then with the last one where she unleashes her power and gets her revenge on these bullies. And already we can see we've got multiple different frames, multiple different attitudes, multiple different themes coming through this one costume. So if we just break these down, I've got a quick little breakdown for them. So it starts in your school. We've got hopeful, nervous, excited. So we've got center frame, medium shot. She's just off center. We've got chest height camera. So it's a pretty standard shot. I've got a little indication that she's talking to someone with a little out of focus thing in the bottom left-hand side. The next shot, we went through this one. She's bullied, she's trapped, she's worried. We can see here I've trapped her in the right-hand side of the frame. The bully taking up most of the shot. Chest height camera again. As an audience, we're with her in this one. Ostracized by the peers, she's lonely, withdrawn. We've got a contrasting space, and we've crocking out the NPCs, and we're pulling focus on her. Again, it's a really powerful one, like being ostracized in a crowd or lonely in a crowd, I think is a really powerful vision. For this one here, we've got scared, in pain, intimidated, pretty obvious again. She's pressured into one side of the screen. We've got parts of the bully in the foreground actually crossing into her face, which is also very powerful. And we've pulled the camera in a lot tighter. So this is a lot more intense, and as an audience, we're with her at this point. These are all fairly obvious things for people that are involved in cinematography, but I think for me, this is the type of stuff that over the last couple of years I've become fascinated with, because it's empowered me to present my characters in a different way, as opposed to just that lineup. And with the last one, of course, she's empowered, possessed, focused. So we've got a center frame, she fills the frame, camera is looking up at her, so we're basically seeing the view of the victims that she's now terrorizing. It's a really powerful and super easy technique. This is actually the same kind of framing for my character with the glasses that I put him in. It was center frame. He was even like popping out the top of the frame. He had his hands crossed and he's looking down across his glasses. And instantly everyone fell in love with it, when earlier in the day everyone was telling me it's not going to fly. So there's an interesting contrast there in how you present it. Yeah, just sweeping through these two. I mean, this is the same character. And if we look at the lineup, you know, you're not getting this information. So I think these two are probably the two most contrasting. The other little thing that comes up, and I saw the hands go up, but we got technical artists here, technical riggers or anything? Yeah, you guys are worth your money. So instantly there's a whole bunch of flags that go up. We're looking at her costume. We've got her in a backpack at the start. Okay, so that's one actor. She's wearing the scarf, the jacket. The next shot, we've got her hands in her pockets. Seems simple. It's probably not, especially if you wanted to have it in real time. She's got her scarf. She's now using it almost like a turtleneck. Her head's being brought into it. Her hair, how is that going to interact with the actual scarf? Really nice thematical thing with the scarf actually going through. Next one, blood, tears. How is your team going to present that? How's your FX team? How's your character team going to work out how that's done? And the last one probably is going to be the more difficult one, is her scarf's going to unwrap, flap around in the air, her hair's going to fly around the place, and then she has two flaps for a jacket flying around as well. So all of these are probably going to be different models, different actors, whatever terminology you use in your studio. And trying to work that stuff out is a lot of work for a lot of people. So already we're hitting on so many points, and all we're trying to do is present a costume, and already there's a whole bunch of information there. These are really quick sketches that I did. I took photos of my wife for the most part and just sketched straight over the top. I dressed her up in what I wanted, and then I sketched straight over the top. So, you know, I can bang out maybe a couple of these in a night. And they're just so powerful with presenting a character, so I highly recommend using the cinematic presentation. So, in closing, I can ramble about this for hours if we want. Plot your story beats, know your narrative, gather up your reference and create the lineup. Do not present your characters in a lineup. You're forcing people to make decisions on one piece of the puzzle, and it can lead to some pretty shonky character design later on. Present your character in a cinematic fashion. So already here, this is really interesting as well. You've got the lineup to the cinematic. I mean, you can see the level of emotion that's in one is just totally absent in the other. And that's all. That's my little tip for you.
Thanks, Richard. That was awesome. Very cool. Different way to think about concept and characters for me. So up next, we have Claire Hummel from Camposanto. You guys are in for a treat.
Oh, God. Setting the bar high.
Okay. There you go.
Hi, guys. My name is Claire Hummel, as he just said. I've spent the better part of the past decade working in video games. I was at Xbox for 6-ish years. Worked on Fable Legends, Sunset Overdrive, took a side gig doing stuff for BioShock Infinite. Ended up at HBO for 2 years working on Westworld VR, which was super fun. And now I'm at Camposanto doing a lot of very cool, very secret things that I cannot talk about. But they'll be great. Totally as good as Firewatch, I promise. So, what I wanted to talk about is visual narrative through character and costume design. Specifically kind of focusing on costume design because it is something that I love. You can really use visuals to display narrative, to display storytelling, and you can effectively communicate things like personality, social standing, culture, career, etc. Functionality with the game, obviously. It's especially interesting to see how thoughtful, thorough research into those areas can really steer you away from character design tropes that are prevalent in games, just like Richard was talking about, and helps you kind of end up with something really unique and ownable, which is very important in this kind of thing. So, of course, when you're starting to design characters, it's very important to determine your setting and universe that you're designing within. This kind of goes without saying, and sometimes you don't really have control over it if you have an art director, if you have a showrunner, things like that. But it's worth thinking about and really internalizing this information as you're going forward with designing your characters. They don't exist in a vacuum. Understanding and establishing this grander context kind of gives you just a way to bounce your character off of various parameters in a really interesting way. So there are a million different ways that you can categorize this, but here are a couple of spectrums. So things like time period and setting obviously make sense if it's a historical setting, near future, sci-fi, what have you. Realistic versus stylized, which kind of explains itself. Literal versus symbolic, where you either have literal, very realistic, ripped from the headlines kind of character designs like we wear today. Or if you have very symbolic costume designs like what you might see in Fury Road or Fifth Element, things like that. And of course, playful versus serious. There are a lot of games that are stylized but serious or playful but realistic, that sort of thing. So time period and setting. I'm definitely biased towards historical settings. It's something I just get a kick out of, so that's where my particular expertise lies. It was an interesting challenge working for Westworld VR because you aren't designing the literal Old West. You aren't designing actual clothing from the 1800s. You're designing a kind of fantastical near-future theme park version of it. So kind of stylized, symbolic character designs become really important in a way that they might not be if you were designing actual cowboys from 1860 in Nevada. So there are a lot of character designs in Westworld, the show, and that we were playing around with in Westworld VR that I would normally despise, but because they're supposed to look tropey, because they're supposed to look like they're out of old Westerns, they become really important. You have Hector Escaton in the upper right-hand corner there, who has this horrid leather jacket and stamped leather hat, and it's so over the top, but he's meant to be this over the top villain who has secret depths, and so it makes sense for his character in that context. Realistic versus stylized, again, I draw a lot of Western stuff apparently for work and play. This is Westworld VR on the left, of course, and then some designs that I did while I was at Xbox for Gunpowder. And so just showing how you can still use the same imagery, but really push it in different directions depending on the final game that you are making. Literal versus symbolic, this is not my art, but it seems very relevant. I love the character designs in Journey. They are so simple, but so effective. And I like how this shows relatively, quote unquote, low poly, simple, deceptively simple character designs, But some of them are very symbolic. There's no one-to-one parallel with things that exist in the real world, like with Journey. And then if you're looking at the overland character designs down below, much more realistic, much more relatable and literal clothing that people might actually wear in real life. Some more examples of literal versus symbolic. The right is for Rise, Son of Rome, where we're allowed to go completely over the top with symbolism of the gods, costume drapery, everything. The stuff on the left is for Power Star Golf. So it's a chick playing golf. She's gonna look pretty normal. Thank you. This is another one. This is for a project that never saw the light of day, but that's okay. This was a really fun project because it was about fallen angels, so we could just go nuts with the symbolic imagery that would not make sense in a realistic narrative. So you get to make a crazy fallen angel covered in crying, screaming people motifs in the armor, which was really fun. And of course, playful versus serious. I kind of loved working at Xbox because it meant, because of the team I was working on a ton of different properties. I think by the time I left, I had touched 60 different games, most of which died. But it was still a great experience. It was very compelling. And so a lot of them, some of my favorite stuff to work on was Sunset Overdrive and Fable Legends. So Sunset Overdrive was like designing the apocalypse in Spencer's Gifts, which was really fun to play around with. And Fable, of course, has this it's an established property with a very defined aesthetic. The shape language of the costumes, the visual wit that's really represented in the storytelling and the dialogue, the tropiness of the characters, it's very like classic British fantasy. It was super fun to play around with. And then if anyone listens to the Adventure Zone, that's a drawing of Magnus on the left, which is really fun because it's just a D&D podcast where a bunch of brothers are dicking around. And so you're allowed to give them camo cargo shorts with scale mail underneath them, because that makes perfect sense. And then serious. Some designs for Abduction on the left, another unannounced project in the middle, and then Robert Lutece for BioShock Infinite. Equally fun to play around with, and good character designs can kind of exist on any number of these spectrums, but having a gritty, realistic, serious, modern-day character doesn't guarantee it's going to be good or bad. It's really important to just keep these in mind because you want your characters to plausibly exist within the context of this grander universe. You are serving the great master that is the story, the gameplay, the game as a whole. So these are sort of my 3 tenets of character and costume design, especially costume design, kind of just costume design, that's okay. So I like to break it down as thinking about character, who is wearing the costume, function, why are they wearing the costume or what's the purpose of the costume, and aesthetic, what is the key visual statement of the costume. So here's a Venn diagram. Oh good, you can see it up there. I can hardly see it here. So function, character, and aesthetic in varying degrees need to work together to create a good, compelling costume and character design. If you just have character and aesthetic, you end up with costumes that don't really have any plausible function within the context of the story. If it's just character and function, but it's visually bland, that's just not exciting. You get the idea. So character, who is wearing the costume, what's their personality, social standing, body type, etc. I think a character's personality, as Richard was saying earlier, affects a lot about their overall design. It's going to affect posture, movement, animation, acting, that sort of thing. And this is why it becomes immensely important to think about this as you're designing the character and try whenever possible to reflect it in how you stage your characters, how you place them on the page, how you present them to art directors, that sort of thing. I'm getting better at it than I used to be. But really thinking about how these characters would wear this clothing, how fastidious or sloppy they are, how comfortable or awkward they might be in a given situation or costume can be a really compelling way to differentiate characters even when they're wearing identical clothing. So a character who's comfortable in a uniform versus someone who's aching to take it off, for example. So here's the same character from Fable Legends. He's supposed to Hulk out at a certain point, and it's a neat comparison of the same costume, technically on the same guy, but on a character with a completely different attitude, completely different body type, and how it really shapes the character and how he comes across. And if you can see up his skirt, accidentally. Function is something I really love to think about. It's probably my favorite part of costume design, and it's very fun to research. But this is really why they're wearing this costume. What's the cultural, societal background within this world? And what's the purpose? Is it uniform? Is it formal wear? Is it for mucking about, etc.? Function can be broken down into a number of topics, but it's generally just this why, and why are any of us wearing anything, honestly? It's important to consider you don't want someone to be in overly formal wear if it doesn't make sense within the gameplay of the game that you're making. The one on the left is from Fable Legends, lots of Fable Legends work up here. And on the right, I have some concepts for hosts from Westworld VR. We had the female host costume already designed for the show itself, and we had to design male costumes to match. And it was really fun to already have the parameters set where it's like, oh, these are supposed to be hot, sexy dudes wearing very low-cut shirts, and then just kind of going from there. They serve a very specific purpose. This was fun, again, for another cancel project at Xbox. There are a lot of those. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, I have this kind of hood scarf design, and the idea was that this was a kind of worldwide secret society. And so coming up with with an item of clothing that they could all wear in a myriad of different ways to represent the society. The guy who designed the one on the right is standing at the back of the room. Hi, Pat. Hey. This is for Scalebound, which was unfortunately also canceled. Getting tired of saying that. But it was super fun to play around with the purpose of this costume, because the idea is that this guy gets ripped out of the modern day, sent into this medieval-esque fantasy world. And so this was coming up with costumes that reflect where he came from, but also show the slow degradation of his clothing, and also as he starts to add on equipment that he's gotten in the medieval era, that sort of thing. And he has to let his buff dragon arm out, so. And finally, aesthetic, what's the key visual statement of the costumes? This is color blocking, shape language, visual symbolism, that sort of thing. I have a redraw that I did of Elizabeth's second costume, which I did not design. Because I think there are ways that you can still maintain the compelling color blocking of costumes while still giving it plausible historical form, thoughtful consideration of what her mother would have actually been wearing given the era, that sort of thing. I feel like I design Harley Quinns in my free time just because it's very easy, but she's a fantastic example of a character who has really compelling aesthetics, really obvious symbolism, color blocking. You have these, the iconography of the Harlequin and the clown motifs, the diamonds, the red and black party color. And so you can take that, shift the time periods around, so whether it's 14th century or 16th century or Victorian or punk, and you can still tell who that character is because of that compelling aesthetic value that kind of bursts through. So again, just looking at that Venn diagram, it's important. So in other words, do this. I think Leia's costumes from the original trilogy are fantastic. They are aesthetically compelling. They speak to her character, and they speak to the situation that she is in, the purpose of the clothing, whether it's utilitarian, whether she's actually dealing with politics, things like that. And don't do this, where someone goes to bed with like flimsy strings of pearls on and her hair up, and you can't pay attention to the movie because it's so bad. Or alternatively, she's having a chill, like by the fire dinner date with her bae, and she decides to wear these weird arm corsets. It's just kind of the worst, so don't do that. And of course, once you actually have to put stuff in the game, As we were just talking about earlier, you're going to have to accept that eventually gameplay and technical restraints are going to rain on your parade. But it's okay, because sometimes those parameters give you interesting inspiration, give you things to play off of. Evian, whatever her name is from Fable Legends, had this extremely complicated skirt that was going to be a pain in the butt to rig, but we eventually figured out ways where we could swoop them off to the side, group it together so it could be a much simpler rig. And then with Elizabeth, with young Elizabeth, we used damage that sort of shows up as the game goes on as a way to communicate progression in the game, communicate her as a character breaking down, and also kind of demarcating where she is going to have the big transformation where she changes into her second worse outfit. I should probably finish this up, so I'm not going to talk a ton about research and reference, but do it. It's really important. We can talk about it later. And I'll leave you with this great slide of furry art of mine from high school, and now what I draw, which looks a lot better because I research and I think about character design. So yeah, do that. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Claire. That was lovely and very dense for 12 minutes. That was awesome. Okay, up next, after this talk, you will not be able to look in the mirror the same way as you do today. So I would like to introduce Laurel from Blizzard Entertainment.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laurel Austin. I am a principal artist at Blizzard Entertainment, and I'm here to talk about expressive faces for your characters in concept art and illustration. At Blizzard, primarily I do marketing art for games like Hearthstone, StarCraft, Diablo, World of Warcraft. And before I came to Blizzard, I began my career as a concept artist at Splash Damage, where I was the character concept artist on the post-apocalyptic first-person shooter called Brink. More recently, I've done a lot of artwork for Blizzard's 2.5D cinematics, including the series Burdens of Shaohao, and some art from Lords of War and Harbingers. These are sort of unusual projects. They're kind of short films that are made up of a series of illustrations, and to these illustrations, our team adds kind of slight animation and parallax, not full animation, but somewhere between a motion comic and a full 2D animation. And I've always loved painting faces, but it was on these projects in particular that I really came to understand how a focus on facial expressions can really enhance storytelling. In each of these shorts, you follow a character through one of the most pivotal moments in their lives, and it's important to spend a lot of energy making the character's emotional state really clear. A well-chosen expression can put your character into their context, tell their story, and make them seem real. And in my career as an artist, a well-chosen expression is what I found to be one of the most powerful tools I found to connect with viewers. And I found that this understanding has changed the way that I approach character art in general. So now, whether I'm doing concept art or illustration, I try to imply as much story and character in the faces as possible. So today I'm going to share with you a way I found helpful to break down expressions into their constituent parts so that they can be used as an artistic tool. Most of us are roughly familiar with how psychologists break down the basic emotions. There's some disagreement on the particulars of this, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on 6 basic expressions. This is happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, and surprise. Expressions themselves are constellations of many small facial movements, and we should think of these small movements as the building blocks for our characters' performances. We know a lot of this stuff intuitively, but in real life, it can actually be quite difficult to see all the elements of an expression. We're so used to reading each other's faces in our daily lives that when we see an expression on another person's face, we often just directly perceive the emotion that it means to us, and we don't notice all the little elements that make it up. Consequently, it can be hard to visualize exactly what an expression or what an emotion looks like. If you ask people what happiness looks like, most people would just say a smile. But as most artists know, there's a lot more to it than that. So bear with me while I take a few minutes to break down the basic expressions, and let's look at some of the elements. Here, you have the expected upward movement of the corners of the mouth, but what people often don't notice is that when that happens, the nostrils kind of get pulled along with it. The muscles of the mouth pull aside and pull the nostrils to the side as well. And the third thing in a smile is really the raise of the lower eyelids. This is what psychologists call a Duchenne smile, and it's the hallmark of a true and genuine happy smile, rather than one that's kind of weird or fake. And when we dial up the intensity, all the characteristics just get a bit more extreme. And you can get new elements added, like a raise to the eyebrows or an opening of the mouth. With sadness, most people know the downward movement of the corners of the mouth, but one thing people don't often notice about frowns is that the downward curve is partly created by an upward movement of the middle of the lower lip. In addition, the center of the eyebrows raises up and slightly contracts. Sadness is also a particularly good example of how small changes can make a really big difference in how in the impression that the face gives. It doesn't take much to change the impact of an expression at all. Here, we barely move the face at all, but by adding more tension into the mouth and brow and some tears welling up in his eyes, it adds a lot more intensity to the expression. And one thing that game artists are often called upon to deliver is anger. Mild anger is relatively simple. Our guy here looks a bit peeved. His lips are pursed, his jaw is kind of clenched and thrust forward, his eyebrows go down, and his nostrils move upwards. And if you intensify anger, some surprising things start to happen. You get the obvious increase in the upper face tension, where you get the lines as the different muscles smush against one another. But in the lower face, I want you to see what happens in the mouth and neck. The tension in the neck and the lips are deeply intertwined and are mostly caused by a muscle called the platysma. It's actually one of my favorite muscles. And it lies as a sheet in your neck that actually that goes from the bottom of your face right over your clavicles, and it's right at the surface under your skin. And this is the striated lines that you often see in comic book heroes, and when they're really straining and like punching each other in comic books. So anytime you get a downward movement of the corners of the mouth, this muscle is activated, and that's when you see those lines. With disgust, it's good to think about it as your face trying to escape or expel whatever the disgusting stimulus is. Here, you get the mouth and the nose squishing upwards, the corners of the mouth moving down, and you get a squint to the eyes. The squint to the eyes can include the eyebrows, but it doesn't have to. With extreme disgust, you get all the features intensifying, but you might also get the tongue protruding as though it's trying to spit out something gross. With fear, you get a widening of the eyes, a flare of the nostrils, an upward movement to the eyebrows, and inwards as well. And you get a bit of a downward movement to the corners of the mouth. And when you intensify fear, all that movement becomes more extreme, and you might also get an opening of the mouth and nose in something like a gasp or an intake of breath. This movement of the nose is actually quite distinct to the one we talked about on happiness, because this one actually indicates like the muscles in the nose taking in breath, so it's a bit different. In surprise, the whole face can appear to stretch vertically. The brow goes straight up, the eyes widen, and the mouth can open. In this case, even though his jaw is slightly open, his lips are still together. So you kind of get that surprise face where your lips are still together. And more extreme surprise, the mouth might open fully, and all the elements again become more exaggerated. So all of this stuff is pretty simple. We see people's faces every day. And we all know that these little constellations of facial movements can make up these expressions. But what happens when we start to combine them? And this is where things really start to get interesting. We can combine aspects from one expression to aspects of another, and this is how we create the most truly interesting and subtle effects. So if we add aspects of happiness to aspects of surprise, what do we get? Free puppies. Here, his mouth opens and the corners go up, as you expect from happiness. His eyebrows raise, as in surprise, and you get the lower lid raise, indicating that he is indeed very happy about the puppies. And then, what happens if we, instead of surprise, swap out anger? You get, the mouth position is actually identical here. It is exactly the same, but his eyebrows contracting make a face that suit a very different story, a story that may or may not have happened to me in high school. You can even combine the same two expressions in different ways for different effects. And if we dial back the intensity, you get, adding slight anger to slight happiness, you get the ever-useful smolder. This expression is found on box art a lot and occasionally on actual humans. Here you get the eyebrows contracting a little bit, a bit of the lower lid raise, and a slight upturn to the mouth. And sometimes we have a very specific story moment we have to work to. In this case, surprise and fear. Let's say your kid backing your car into a mailbox. Here, the mouth opens, the eyes widen, the eyebrows contract as in fear, and the eyebrows raise more. Fear and surprise actually have are actually quite similar expressions and share a lot of elements, so you have to identify which parts are sort of iconic to each particular expression. In this case, the eyebrow contraction is very important to indicate fear. But what if our story changes and we have to add elements of a third expression? Something like disgust. Here, it might suit a story a bit more like this. So again, you have an unchanged eye movement. You have an unchanged eye movement because disgust really doesn't come into the eyes a whole lot, but you get the nose wrinkling, the corners of the mouth pulling down, and the lips protruding, but you still have the open mouth like in fear and surprise. You can even combine diametrically opposed emotions to really nice effect. And it's worth experimenting to see what sorts of impressions you can get by adding bits of expressions to one another. So how do we improve at making expressive faces? Keep a mirror around. Pay close attention to the way your own face looks and as you study the basic expressions, and use it to help you try things out. Justin can attest that I do have a mirror at my desk for this exact purpose. Study the anatomy. There are dozens of muscles in the face, and while you don't need to know all of them, knowing the major groups of them will really help you understand what bits affect one another and how it all comes together. Mixing and matching bits of basic expressions is a way I found helpful to help me understand more complex expressions. What I've shown you here is just the tiniest sliver of what you can do. It's almost like paint in the end, where you can just take little bits of one and add them to a lot of another, and you get like infinite possibilities. Things like insanity, egotism, impatience, they all just get a bit more flavor if we can throw in things that are unexpected. So using this approach to facial expressions has helped me add more layers to my character art, and I hope you found it helpful too.
Thank you, Laurel. That was awesome. Very eye-opening. Very cool. And last, but definitely not least, we have Simon from D-Pad Studios.
Hello. So I'm Simon S. Andersen. I'm the art director for a game called Owlboy and a studio called D-Pad Studio. It was a pixel platformer with an emphasis on flying mechanics. So if you're expecting a 3D talk, then unfortunately you're in the wrong place. Has anyone actually played it here? Yes, there are people. It exists. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about is finding the purpose and final touches to your character designs, because a lot of times you have kind of what you want, but not quite. I'm not going to dictate exactly how you're going to do this, so just think of it as the thing that you can add to your toolbox and then discard all the rest of it. Okay, everyone on board? Okay. So, AKA long title, yeah. This is the game I made. It's very pretty. And these are all the characters that I did. They're also very pretty. Okay, so first off, what is the purpose of your design? So context and purpose are going to be integral to what your design needs to look like. So what audience is it made for? What is its function within your game? How does the design blend with the universe that you've already made? And second, what do you do when you know the goal of your design, but it kind of feels off? So most of you are familiar with concepts like strong silhouettes, color theory, abstract shapes, and main character traits, mostly because these guys already told you about it. So, but sometimes you have those things and your design still doesn't quite work. So let's start up with design purpose. I'll start up with some examples on how perspective can guide your design to become more interesting. And I'll do that by bringing up a game that I did not design, which would be these ones. Here we have the Minish Cap, we have Seiken Edetsu, we have Breath of Fire. All of these are top-down games which you look for a specific direction. And they are, I have handwritten notes, it's great. So certain projects will require you to view your game from a certain angle. So this is especially true for 2D art and pixel art, but sometimes 3D. And usually you're stuck with the perspective you choose for the majority of the project. So you want to reuse your assets as much as possible. And as such, the perspective you pick is really important to your character design. Often these days you make these decisions, take these decisions for granted, just as how things are. But let's look at Link, for example. So if you look at his design, there's a lot of emphasis on the hair and the hat, because that's what you want to see from a top-down perspective. For example, if you look at here, this is a very different illustration than what you see in the instruction manuals. Emphasis on the hair, very important, because that's all you're going to see. You're not going to see much of the torso. So from a character design perspective, he might seem fairly plain. Now, this is a character clearly designed for low resolutions when you did not have a lot of memory for your consoles. However, if you compare the design to the more recent ones, you can kind of see how it's changed. There's a lot more emphasis on the mid-body and what you carry. I mean, you can see that the shield is carried on the back, and you have that nice big belt going there, but it does actually serve a purpose. It shows that the center of mass is in the center of the character. It's not just some sort of casual trait that you do. And I would say it's not a surprise that the later Zelda games have been using the Wind Waker design. Again, an emphasis on the hair, you still have the hat on it, and there's a lot less emphasis on the lower half of the body. So all of this is done in sections. And I also want to take a footnote. Take a moment to consider whether or not you picked certain shapes for your character as if it was supposed to be that way, or because it actually serves a function. Okay, so some rules of thumb for design theory. Now, there's some simple rules I want to bring attention to. Again, you're probably familiar with practices like outlines and body shapes and all of that. So I want to bring attention to two of them. Repeated color blocks and consistent patterns. Now, finding color blocks is really simple and is a good rule of thumb for any design. So the gist is that you pick a certain set of colors for your character and make sure they're repeated throughout the design pleasingly. I think Street Fighter is a pretty good example of that. Notice that most of the characters here, the colors are repeated more than once and usually takes up a large space. So picking too many colors can feel busy and inconsistent. Of course, it depends on what kind of project you're doing. Lost my train of thought here. If something feels off or it feels inconsistent, do a quick color check to see if any of the colors are actually repeated or you're adding redundant color, or for that matter, if they're too similar. You can also break the rules by adding a focus color. Now, your color choices can be nice and spread out, but having a single dominant color without repetition can be surprisingly satisfying. Next, we have consistent patterns. I think this is the wrong slide, actually. Well, never mind. Often you add minor details to our designs, and we forget that a particular shape or line is more pleasing if it repeats itself throughout the character. If there are a number of defining shapes, then you'll start feeling that something is off. So I'll be using my own main character as a good example for this. So this is Otis. He's the main character of my game. Very nice. And when I say nice, it is a sketch from roughly 10 years ago. And he does look terrible. He's got some basic ideas here, but just to point them out, you can see that he has some barely visible eyebrows. He has some sort of sideburn kind of thing. He has like a checkerboard thing on his neck, just plain hands, and the only repeatable pattern that I can kind of see is the black around his neck and the little line around his feet. So let's jump forward. This is his final design. Now, in the final version, the differences might appear subtle, but I'll point them out. So for the shapes, there are pointed tips all throughout his design. So if you look at the hair, the sideburns, the eyebrows, and the tips of his shoes, all of those are points. Also, his neck fluff, incidentally, mirrors the shape of his shoes. Now you have consistency. I've also employed color blocking, which you can see here. The shoes and cloak, shoes, cloak, and hair share the same colors, as do his sweater and eyebrows, as well as his sweater edges and neck fluff, and his skin and his pants are purposely made to be similar to make his face stand out less. So the only element here that stands out are his gloves, because they are the main element in the game. If you played Owlboy, you know that you do a lot of carrying in the game, so you want to see his gloves at all times. But just to make sure that it fits the whole theme of it, I've added two little dangly relic things that show up when you run, so it doesn't feel too intense. However, I would make an argument that sometimes when you make these main shapes, it's usually difficult to find them when you're doing it in a big resolution, especially when you're doing small sprites. So oftentimes, I will actually design a character in pixel art. This was the in-between before I did the finalized design. Now, whoop, there it is. So this is what you look like between the two different designs. By translating the original sketch to pixel art, I had to choose the elements which stood out the most. So his color placement, his big neck, emphasis on the sideburns, eyebrows, and all that came from the small scale. You can kind of see how that moved along. So, also, just a little side thing. If you're looking at your design and you're thinking, these things are nice, but I can't quite tell if they're fitting the theme of it, try to remove them instead. Take away every single part and see what feels weird. Then put them back and emphasize. All right, so next up. How to do abstract design principle on realistic characters. Now, let's see here. So it's a very common issue that the design of one thing doesn't mirror the feel of the style of something else in the world. This is also something. This is also one of the reasons why pixel art traditionally has been so so easy to iterate on. For example, when you rotate a pixel, you kind of break the consistency. Consistency is the most important thing when you're doing character design and when you're trying to make things fit into the world. But this also applies to realistic characters. So I'm going to use the example of how Marvel translated their characters from comic books into movies, and to show you how they did that. So on the surface, it's sort of the standard idea that, well, they kind of grayed them out and gave them more detailed suits, and that's why they fit in. But I want to make the argument that it's very subtle things drawn in from the world that makes these things fit. To use Captain America as an example, here you see the movie version. One of the things they've done here is that they've incorporated subtle design cues from the military personnel that he's actually hanging out with. You can see that on his belts, you can see that on his helmet. It's still the same character, but because it shares those consistent design traits, that's why he fits in. If you instead had taken the design from, let's say, the comic books, where he has sort of his fish scale armor thing, there's nothing that draws parallels between the area that he's in and the area that he is supposed to represent. And you can practically do this with everything. If your movie is looking like a giant neon landscape, you want your characters to look like that neon landscape. If your characters are dark and gritty, you want them to reflect that. So draw in things from the rest of your world, and your characters will feel more alive. So just a final thought, because we don't really have that much time. I've rambled a lot about different design principles, and maybe not all of it made sense, but I would urge every one of you to break every single thing that I said, because I'm just some guy and I have random opinions. And I'm pretty sure that most of you will figure out a lot more interesting ways to design characters than I can up on stage in 10 minutes. So, thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much. I want to just do one more round of applause for the panelists up here to participate in this. I appreciate it very much. This is kind of just an experiment to see how we can evolve the art talks and the art presentations at GDC. So again, fill out your surveys, let us know what you think, and we'll continue to iterate on this format. And I believe we have some time for some questions, so there's some mics here on the side. If anyone has any questions for any of the panelists, go ahead and ask away.
Hi, my question is for Richard. When you are like designing those like little vignettes, are you just putting one of your favorite designs in them and then presenting them to the rest of your team, or? Yeah, that was for you. Sorry.
Basically what I was trying to get at, maybe I didn't explain it very well, but once you've got those scenes set up, it's very easy to swap out your costumes.
Okay.
I mean, for the most part, you know, our casting and our costume comes in 2 different waves for us at Naughty Dog. Costume-wise, once we know what that person's going to look like, ethnicity, age, you know, all kinds of other things we take into account, it's mainly just going to be costume at that point. So once you've got that scene set up, what I like to do is I swap out all my costumes and I test them in that environment. So again, you have multiple pieces of the puzzle in play, there's a narrative in there, and you're testing that costume against that. So, for instance, stereotypes and tropes, in a lot of cases when I started doing this process, instantly it was too heavy-handed. Do you know what I mean? You're beating the audience over the head, going, this guy's a villain, or this guy, you know. So you find out that subtlety is where you want to be. You want to, as I think a few of us said, you want to support the narrative and support the design. You don't want to be distracting people from that. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Maybe just to clarify, my question was sort of about like getting buy-in from the team. You mentioned how at first they didn't like the glasses on your Bruiser character, but then they did. Was that because you presented all of those with the designs that you wanted?
I did. So in that presentation that I did, I first showed a lineup of characters, realized that people were making decisions based on too little information. Then I set up a scene with this chap who's looking all, you know, empowered by the framing and the setup of the shot, and then I repeated all those costumes within that.
Oh.
And I was confident that the glasses were going to sell, and I thought that it was a better way of presenting it, and they did. Everyone came back the next day and was like, "We're thinking the glasses are pretty cool now." And you're like, "Okay, cool. Yeah." Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. As a writer, can you guys describe what you would like to see when a writer pitches like a character overview, like some specific elements?
I can at least speak from the perspective of my current team I'm working with. Sean Vanneman, who's the writer at Campo Santo and one of the founders of Campo, will often be figuring out characters by writing out these small dialogue vignettes. And it has been immensely helpful for me to be able to just more so than just writing down on paper saying like, they're quirky or they're sassy. Seeing them in context and interacting with each other gives me so much to play around with. And so it already helps me in the same way that by showing them actually in a scene, that also gives me something to build off of, and it has been immensely helpful. So anytime I can actually get dialogue or kind of a vertical slice of what a scene might be like, even if it's completely scrapped later in production, I've found that to be very helpful.
All right, thanks.
I've also found that if you are clear about how you want the viewers to feel about the character, like if you want them to be vulnerable or if you want them to feel powerful or anything like that, that's important stuff for visual artists to know.
All right, thanks.
Hi. So for Claire, you had like that whole section on reference, and you had to rush through it. And I was wondering, with a bit more time, if you or anybody had more to say about that stuff, because that seemed cool.
Yeah, reference is super important and very important to my process. I wholly recommend when you're working on a character, get your raw ideas unadulterated by reference down on paper. Start researching, start doing studies from that research to really internalize the reference, because you start to build up this muscle memory and you build an internal library in your brain to draw from, which is way better than just scrolling constantly through your Pinterest pages. And then you integrate the reference, and then once you get to that point, you have to kind of put your foot down and also decide when you break from that reference, because it's meant to be guidelines to guide your design in the right direction. But again, you're making a game, you're making it in the context of other characters and story. And so being able to decide what you're drawing from, how you're going to integrate it is super important. If you like artists, look at the artists they are looking at instead of looking at their work. Yeah.
Thanks.
That's my spiel.
I'm going to add something to that as well, that with the reference gathering that I do, I often find it really helpful to involve the rest of the character team as well, especially if you know which model is going to work on it or which animator is going to work on it. Get them involved really early. There's a part of the character production in games which seems to separate those groups, and some people get turned into just 3D machines, and other people are sort of left with probably too much responsibility and not enough people chiming in. So I think it's really good when you're collecting that reference. I go and chat to the character modeler as well, and I get them collecting reference as well, so they're invested, they've got ideas in there also.
Hi, so a quick question on the decision-making process that you guys do. When you go through the girl with the glasses, at what point do you think it's safe to expose your concept art and the entire story to outside of the art department, essentially? And how do you prevent randomization from like biz dev people who are maybe not so great at looking at the full story and saying, okay, we get it?
I think once you've got those scenes set up, I think it's safe to start, at least at the moment. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. It's a really organic process. No game is ever the same to work on. You're always going to get, look, at least at Naughty Dog, it's very flat, so you're going to get a lot of opinions from different departments, and you've got to be flexible on that, and you've got to realize that your idea is not always going to be the best, and even, it might not be your taste that we're going for. So my advice would be to put your best foot forward, but always be flexible when those opinions come in. It's a tough thing, I think, as concept artists, especially if you're sitting near a hallway, as I do, a walkway. So you're constantly having people like, oh, what's that? What's this character? You're like, hey, yeah, the 10th time today. You're like, oh, okay, chat about it again. It's tough, but it's. I think you have to be flexible and remember that it's not your baby. It's a big group of super talented people, and the best thing you can do is make sure that they're excited about something. So, yeah, I would say take the time and stay flexible and don't sit in the corner and do it in isolation.
Thank you.
So I'm curious. You talked a bit about the idea of pushing away from some of the tropes, archetypes, stereotypes. I'm wondering how you guys strike the balance between sort of familiar, easily understandable, clear concepts and more nuanced characters with depth. How do you guys walk that line?
Who's answering this one? You?
Team effort, I imagine.
Team effort. I can say from our point of view, we look a lot at film, costuming in film. We like to keep it, it's still fairly heavy-handed with Uncharted. The Last of Us is a little bit more subtle. We have such amazing animators and acting and script and everything going on. There is so many other things in play that educate the audience, including the framing and stuff that I was talking about, as to how we go about presenting that. Subtle for me at the moment is always the best plan. I would say that the majority of characters I'm drawing at the moment are like t-shirt and jeans. You know what I mean? Like I just sit around with a lot of photos and sketch them up. And like, oh, it's another dude in t-shirt and jeans. Keep it real subtle. That person's going to behave in a certain way. The tough guy one is a really interesting narrative. We were talking about it over lunch. Joe Pesci is one of my favorite tough guys. If I did him in a lineup of tough guys, no one's going to pick him. But when you're in that scene and there's that tension and he's scaring the hell out of everyone, then then that comes across. So I don't know. To answer your question, thematically, there's some really nice things you can play to in a game as subtle as The Last of Us. But my intention is always to support everything else that's going on and not to distract from it.
Yeah.
No, go.
I think it really depends on the narrative of the game as well, or the narrative of anything you're doing, and the needs of that narrative and how viewers are supposed to feel about that narrative while they're experiencing it. And you sort of have, like, if you have to concept it like a nerdy character, you're like, well, nerds have glasses, so I'll put them in glasses. And that's sort of, like, it's obvious. It may be the right thing to do, but it's not so much that you have to, like, totally be like, no, nerds can't have glasses because they always have glasses. No, like, it's not, it's more like, do what you're doing, but do it with intention. Like, say, the audience has to feel this way, so my choices are going towards that. So it's like, if I want a character to, again, feel vulnerable, make them physically small. If you want them to blend in, maybe they have, they don't contain any bright colors. Maybe all the values are sort of close together, and so when they're put into their context, they sort of blend in a little bit more. So it's thinking about all of those things and making a character, whatever style it's in, to be unique and whatever it needs to be for its context.
I was just going to say that I love looking at dogs as good inspiration for character design, in terms of you can have really shitty little dogs and really sweet little dogs, and the physicality of them is not really defines who they are as a character. And it's great to think of character designs that same way. It's like the acting and animation, which again is why you involve those teams, can bring so much to those characters and can actually play against the expectations that the audience has in really interesting ways. So
That's awesome. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. I was just standing here to encourage the responses continuing. Thank you for that. It'd be a blast to hear from the whole panel if you'd like to share some thoughts as well. Not to eat up the whole time frame for us.
Is this thing on? Okay. One of the things that I've experimented a lot with is basing character design on shape. So all of my characters, or the main characters that I usually do, are based on some sort of base shape. And then I try to squish them and see what that makes them do. So I have one character that I like in particular called Alphonse. I designed him to be a pear. That's what he was. And part of his personality came from just trying to see him run. Because, he was a big guy, but it was interesting because I started thinking about how do the mechanics work? Because he had like a large bulbous, bottom end, let's just say that. But I started thinking about it, and I realized that this doesn't make sense for his anatomy. Why is that? And eventually it hit me that he's a robot. And because he's a robot, that implies a lot of the way he acts and the way he does things. And I ended up doing that with all the characters. I had a main character whose face was just kind of a big oval. And to kind of even that out, I gave him a big hat. But because I gave him the hat, it gave him a lot of expressive traits. One of the reasons why he ended up being really shy and kind of cowardly was because he had to interact with his hat. What do you do with it? Well, you pull it down over your head. I feel like shape and just squishing them and using them and throwing them around, that's a way to get to know your character. I think that's about all I got.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for Richard. So your work is a lot of really beautiful line work with like solid color underneath. I'm just wondering from like more of a technical execution standpoint, like how do you tackle designs that ask for like unique texture? Or is that something that you ever encounter during your work and that you have to like show texture in a flat color or a line work without sort of painting? Is that something that you do, or do you have ways to get around it?
I think that the line work and the way I'm approaching art at the moment is interesting for me, just as an artist, so I've started doing it over the last couple of years. Also, I'm fortunate enough at our studio that our creative directors are big comic fans. Neil Druckmann's a massive comic nerd, so he loves seeing that stuff, and he's able to read it really well. We're also working on projects where things are in known quantity, jeans, sneakers, I don't know how many dudes I drew with machine guns, but they get it. It's an army boot, it's army pants. So once again, I'm collecting reference and I'm talking to those character modelers, so everyone's on the same page. By the time I spit out those lineups of concepts, everyone understands what they're looking at because we've sat around and we've talked about what kind of materials we can execute on. You chat to technical riggers about secondary motion for your army guys, and your material artists about the difference between a fatigue and a hand grenade or whatever else is going to be there. So I'm very lucky in that regard that we have that open conversation. There are other characters where you have to paint the bejesus out of it, you're photo bashing the hell out of it. For those that played Uncharted 4, there's a couple of characters I worked on that are executed to a borderline photo rendering state. The old adventurer who passes away in the mansion. Is it spoilers? Whatever. There's an old adventurer. So for that one, you had to take a different tack. So that's very much photo bashed. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So like you kind of take a different way to approach it instead of the line art if you needed texture work.
Yeah, I think it made sense to me because I'm already trying to be incredibly social on the floor and with the rest of the character department.
Right.
And I find that things go a lot more smoothly by being that way. And then all of a sudden, it didn't make sense to be rendering the hell out of everything. So, I mean, everyone that needs to know just sat down and looked at the reference, and now I'm photo bashing that reference back into something, it didn't make any sense. So what's left to decide? Shape language, the weighting of the character, where these elements have got to be. So for me, I sort of fell into this line art, comic book type stuff. And plus, it's really fun and it's super quick. You can just you can bash them out really fast.
All right, thank you.
I do think that's a super important point about concept art, though, is that it's not about making finished illustrations. It's very tempting to finish these things and polish them because it's all about your art. You're part of this larger pipeline, and so you need to communicate just enough to whoever's next in that pipeline. And yeah, I've often found that when I was younger in the industry, I would just painstakingly render these things because I wanted the accolades of having beautifully painted a thing, but I could have just as easily done line art, flats, and then call out textures, and it would have communicated it just as well, possibly better. So being a concept artist, I know you go to ArtStation and start looking through portfolios where everything's just polished to a T, but sometimes that's a bunch of polish on a bad design. I'd rather see an unfinished good design that communicates well rather than something that's been painted for a week on end that's useless.
That is the most important thing I think anyone has said today. It's really confusing for concept artists. You look at CG Talk, you look at ArtStation, you see all this marvelous art. It's not about that. It's about making a game. So, I can't emphasize that here. That's a very good point. Yeah. You're making a video game, you're not making an art exhibition.
Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for Laura. When you mentioned you just combine some features of face of different emotions, like a surprise or sorrow, you combine them like randomly, or there's a rule behind the combination?
There's definitely thought on which ones, like which aspects of which one you might combine, and that really comes down to sort of performance and your own feeling about what it ought to be. That's why I say keep a mirror around. So if you're thinking like, okay, I have this situation that I want to make an expression for, and what face does my character make? And so you can kind of test it out in the mirror, and once you kind of have something there, you can think, okay, maybe this character feels derisive compared to the person he's talking to. He's looking down at them, so maybe he's kind of sneering with a little bit of disgust. So you're adding a bit of a lip curl to that face. So it's really it's an artistic tool. It's not like A plus B equals C. It's a way to sort of break it down and think about what you're doing. Yeah, that's about it.
You just like try to be an actor.
Basically, yeah. It's what animators do. It is just what they do, and they've known this for a long time. So this would be not very new to them. But for 2D artists, I found it was new to me anyway.
Okay, thank you.
My question's for Simon. You had a very long development process of almost 10 years. So I was wondering how often you had to reiterate your main characters or any of your characters in terms of design, and how important it was for bringing other artists to look at your work.
Yeah, it was 9 months. No, 9 years minus 1 month. So it was quite some time. The main character actually was a point of contention because it was literally one of the first things I made for the project. And after working on it for maybe 5 years and realizing that it's not really all that good, you can't just trade out about 200 animations. So what we did instead was that we compensated by making the animations more fluid and giving more emphasis on what you did. So we did a talk yesterday where we showed the difference between the running animations on the beginning and afterwards, showing how you did turn cycles and you added emphasis to movement when you flew and that sort of thing. In terms of the game itself, the good thing about the game was that we didn't do the game with tile sets, we did it with assets. So it was big pixel chunks that you could put anywhere. And incidentally, that also means that they're fairly easy to replace. We did very big pieces, and mostly the really old stuff was in the very middle of the game. So when you're flying through that part, the quality is kind of there. The tutorial levels were sort of late development, and then the very last stages, I think I did something like a 3,000 pixel scroll just to show that I could do something proper for once. I feel like that was a good way to compensate. Sure, the sprite is fairly old, but animation is always appreciated. So that was how we solved that.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panel for a wonderful presentation, and if there are any further audience questions, the breakout room across the hall is available.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.